Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And today we've got Harley Schlanger back to talk about tariffs. What a big topic that is. So let's get started. Or, as we say here, let's go. And welcome, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin, and with me, my guest today is Harley Schlanger of the LaRouche Organization and the Schiller Institute, joining us from Potsdam, Germany. And Harley, thanks again for making time for us here at McDuff Lives. We sure appreciate it, and thanks for joining me today.
Well, I always have time for you, John. I enjoy our discussions, and hopefully your viewers do too.
Oh, yes, yes, indeed. And the viewership is building up. And in fact, I now have 4,996 followers on Twitter. So four more and we get to 5,000. And I'll be,
Okay.
so I feel pretty good about that. And, but Harley, the topic that I put up today is a big topic on your mind, I know, and that is the Trump tariffs. And it needs explanation. People need to understand what's really at stake here with these tariffs. I know a lot of my friends that are on the MAGA side are very pleased and thinking, yeah, well, we're going to just keep on doing more tariffs and Trump will figure this out and it's all going to rebound to our benefit. But that's not the way that I hear you speaking about it. And having just watched Diane Sayre's State of the Union speech yesterday, I am sure that it's not the way that she sees it either. So Trump's tariffs, good thing, bad thing, and is it endangering the economy?
Well, I'll definitely talk about that. I just want to remind people that it was 4 years ago today that Putin launched the special military operation in Ukraine. And along with the tariff problem, we still have the wars. We have the suspended animation over Iran. So there's a lot going on, and we'll pick it up. And on the good side, it looks like the chaos inside the British Empire is continuing. So the tariff question is really, it's something people don't understand generally, because there's a difference between a tariff the way Trump is using it, which Jameson Greer, his trade representative, actually understands some of it by the letter of the law in terms of this being part of the American system. But unfortunately, he doesn't understand the American system. So he can cite the fact that the tariff that Trump is using was modeled on Alexander Hamilton, the attempt to allow for a capability for manufacturing in the United States right after the American Revolution. But that's about as far as it goes. So let me break it down in two different parts. First, what we're being told is just not true. We're told that by putting a tariff on goods, it brings in a lot of money to the United States, and it allows the U.S. to overcome the trade deficit, which is fairly large, and also provides money for the government. And on top of that, it means that we can compete more effectively in manufacturing because of the higher prices for imported goods. And so what they cite is, I think it's $256 billion in tariffs that they collected. Now, the problem is that's not paid by the foreign competitors. That's paid by the people who import the foreign goods, which means U.S. consumers and U.S. corporations. So the Economic Institute in Kiel, Germany, which is one of the better statistical compilation services, put out a report on the first 11 months of the tariff policy and said, yes, indeed, the U.S. did get $260 billion, but 94% of that was paid for by U.S. corporations who compensated by raising prices and U.S. consumers who had to pay higher prices for the imported goods. So it's not as though countries that were cheating us by competing unfairly were paying. We were taxed. That's the first point. The second point then is that what happened to that money? Did it go into credits for industry to hire new people, to go into research and development, to create jobs? No, it went into the overall government pot to supposedly lessen the deficit. But the reality is that the trade deficit continued to grow the entire year by $1 trillion. It went up $1 trillion in the first 11 months of 2025. And at the same time, the number of jobs in manufacturing fell 11 out of 12 months. So if the idea was that you get foreigners to pay for their unfair competitive practices and that it allows the United States to put credit into industry and create new jobs, that did not happen. And I think what this shows is that the people who promoted this idea, namely Jameson Greer, Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, I'm not sure who else, they don't understand what Hamilton actually did. So if you want to break that down a little more, that's the first problem. Then we can go on to the bigger problem after that. Is that fairly clear, John?
Thank you. Yeah. And one of the things that it's kind of puzzling me is why are they talking about Alexander Hamilton? What is what they're doing have anything to do with Alexander Hamilton, and why is that a selling point? The people that vote Republican, they don't know nothing about I mean, excuse me for being a little bit, but most people don't have a clue as to why it's important to identify Hamilton's policies, much less talk about them in a public forum.
Well, think about the slogan, "Make America Great Again." When was America great? If you actually look at the problem we're facing today of a trade deficit, of a budget deficit, of inflation, of a shrinking workforce, that was where we were when the nation came out of the Revolutionary War and beat the British. We had no credit capability, no internal credit capability. We were not getting money from overseas. We owed a lot of money. And so Hamilton had to confront exactly what we're confronting today. What did he do? He set up something called the Bank of the United States, which was a bank that individual private citizens could buy some stock in, some shares in it. But most of the money came from the government. That is, the government created credit. And that credit was then directed to potential producers and into infrastructure. So that the Hamiltonian idea came from dirigism in France, from Colbert, from Leibniz. The idea that you can create credit by the government, provided it goes into areas that will produce more wealth than you're borrowing. And that requires technological progress. It requires a skilled workforce. It requires an ability to find markets and also to transport goods and move things cheaply. So that's what Hamilton did. And with the other argument he was going up against was Jefferson and others who said, we shouldn't pay these debts. We can just cancel it. But Hamilton said, look, if you ever want to be able to borrow, you have to show that you're creditworthy. And if we do this right, we will have a debt that will be a blessing in the future. That is, we'll establish ourselves as reliable, honest, and fair. And so by having a tariff policy, what that did was it meant that the British, who were trying to undermine the United States after the American Revolution by selling whatever manufactured goods they had to us cheaply, so that cheaper than we could produce them here in the United States, so that we wouldn't be able to afford to produce them, Hamilton put a tariff on it, a tax. Now, that wasn't to punish them, that was to create the space for his internal credit system to work. And so what he then did was use the National Bank to, I'm sorry. He used the National Bank to generate credit to those entrepreneurs, producers, inventors, and people who could build infrastructure, so that we would have an investment in infrastructure, which cheapens the cost of the overall production. That's the benefit of infrastructure. If you have roads, ports, bridges, power generation, water management, it does allow you to produce things more cheaply. Then the second part of it is by generating credit, you can pay to have new businesses set up, and it will improve the standard of living. It will allow for the more efficient distribution of goods and give people a better standard of living, which makes them more productive. The central piece of Hamilton's policy was, how do you increase the productive powers of labor? Because if you have people working in more efficient means of production, who are better paid, who are happy, who are glad to do the work, that's the ideal situation for a growing economy, in which case you can support a certain amount of debt for a while, knowing that you'll produce your way out of it by increasing the value of your overall productive sector. That's what Hamilton's idea was. Now, what's the idea of knuckleheads like Howard Lutnick? It's, how do you make money?
Right.
How do you make a profit? So if you can make a bigger profit by investing in topless bars and whorehouses and video games than you do if you build up a steel industry, go with the first option. Whatever gives you the best return. And in the US now, for the billionaires, the best return is in the financialization, the securitization sector, paper, betting against other financial instruments. That does not improve productivity. It doesn't improve the standard of living. In fact, it increases the separation between the billionaires who get the profits and the average person who can't afford to play those games. And so the whole idea, and this is something Trump understood when he won his first election. He accused the Obama administration of running up the stock market as a way of saying the economy was in good shape. And Trump said, no, that's not true. If all you're getting is profits from stocks, it doesn't increase the overall physical economy. And so that's why Trump was saying in 2016 that we need banking regulation, Glass-Steagall, and we need investment in industry. Now, he continued to say we need investment in industry, but he dropped the idea of banking regulation. So if banks can make more money by loaning money to their best customers who are stock speculators, that's what they'll do. And on paper, it will increase the value of the accounts and the money in the bank, but that doesn't give you a solid economic foundation. And so that's the problem that you have with the monetarist economists. And that's the problem with Jameson Greer. As far as he goes talking about Hamilton, Henry Clay, Henry Carey, Lincoln, it's refreshing to hear him talk about that, but he doesn't understand what they did. And he doesn't understand that for Hamilton, as an adherent to the ideas of Franklin that he got from Franklin of Leibniz, the it's the physical good production, which it depends, improvement in that depends on the increase in the creativity of your workforce. And so if your workforce is happy, if they're getting educated, if they're getting better housing, better food, better healthcare, they'll be more productive. If they're sitting around every day after a hard day of work trying to figure out if they're going to be able to pay the rent this month, they're not happy, they're less productive, and that's the difference. And so you may be able to show GDP growing, but if you actually look at it, it's a small sector of the economy that's producing the increased GDP, and the larger sector of the economy is struggling to survive. And that's the problem with the Trump tariffs. Now, one other aspect. Why did the Supreme Court vote it down? The Supreme Court was not defending the Hamiltonian system, but they were defending the Constitution. Because what they saw was that the tariff policy of Trump was, for them, a tax. It was a tax, not an old, real well-defined tariff. And the provision in the Constitution for who can determine taxes, that's the prerogative of only the legislative branch, the Congress. The president cannot issue taxes. And so that's how they threw it out. Now, I would say one final point on this. If your whole idea of tariffs is that you use it as a club to get countries that don't agree with you to go along with you, that also goes against the national interest. So when a country refuses to stop selling Russian oil, for example, and Trump threatens to tariff them, put taxes on their exports, that's not an economic policy. That's the best way to look at that is what Scott Bessent did to Iran. He said the sanctions and the embargoes on Iran was an example of economic statecraft, and that was going to bring down the Iranian regime. How wrong was he? The polling agencies, including polling agencies that are not Iranian, are showing that the support for the Iranian government has gone way up because the Iranian government did something smart. They showed Bessent saying that we're punishing Iran for not going along with us. And we're making life miserable for them, making the economy miserable, embargoing food, the cost of food's going up. So what did the Ayatollah do? He went on television and told people that the reason you don't have food on the shelves is not our government, it's what the US is doing. And then he played clips of the Treasury Secretary saying we're engaging in economic statecraft by having the embargoes and the sanctions. So this is the absolutely wrong approach. And I don't know if Trump fully understands it. I think he was sold the idea that tariffs will be a quick way to provide money for revitalization of US industry, but only if corporations have access to that money and a tax policy so they can put that money into new plant and equipment, research and development, and so on. What happened in his first term is with his tax credit policy. This was not John F. Kennedy's tax credit, which said that you can get a tax credit if you invest in plant and equipment and things which improve the productivity of your company. This was a tax credit that gave CEOs and corporate boards the right to invest the money they saved in taxes in buying their own stock and driving their own stock up, increasing their own personal profit, but not improving the solvency or productivity of their corporation. So it's the difference between a physical economic system, which is what LaRouche always talks about as the Hamiltonian model, the Lincoln model, the FDR model, versus a British system, which is buy cheap and sell dear. Get things for as cheap as you can and sell them for as expensive as you can. And the best way to do that is something that doesn't cost anything to produce, like a stock certificate or a financial derivative. So, in a nutshell, I hope that's clear, but that's the problem.
Well, obviously, it's a lot to take in. And while I've been studying this with you guys for 6, 7 years now, I still find myself stopping and saying, wait a minute. Here's one example. When you said dirigist, and I realized, oh, what that means is a directed economy from the top. And that is not what your average Continental soldier voted for or fought for. You know, he fought for, I'm going to build my own house and I'm going to make a family and I'm going to have guns and I'm going to protect my family and I don't need no government for nothing. And
Actually, he did need that, John, because the average person was very happy with the way things turned out. Because by having a well managed financial system, it made every dollar that you made more valuable. It meant that you couldn't be taken advantage of by unscrupulous bankers who manipulate interest rates and stocks and so on. So the idea was not that the government tells every person what to do. And in fact, when you have that system, the bankers, the individual bankers have a choice of how they can invest it. But they'll make more money if they invest it in physical goods production in the long run than they will if they look for speculation.
and we just look back over my lifetime when all of a sudden everything started being made of plastic and coming from Japan and then China. You need a moment?
No, I thought I had this on airplane mode, but I can't figure out these phones. And I don't know why everyone's calling me now. I thought everything was out of the way.
Well, anyway,
Well, let's get back to this because we got to concentrate on it.
yeah, because right now is a very, very important time as people are starting to think about the upcoming midterm elections in the U.S. Um, and the irony, though, of fight a revolution against the European powers, and then the solution to your economic woes is to re-engage with European finance. It just seems kind of counterintuitive, and I can understand why people, the Jacksonians and all, would not want to be involved in this international banking stuff. On the other hand, I'm absolutely convinced that you're right, and that Hamilton was right in doing what he did, and that if we were to get back to what the American system, that we could straighten all this out. Um, I do want to ask a question that was raised by Diane Sayre in her State of the Union speech that I watched last night. The Fed. She said we need to put the Fed through bankruptcy. Whoa, that's kind of scary. Um, what do you? I don't know if you heard what she had to say or not, but
Yeah.
that to me, it's a little like that's like rocking the boat in a big way. How would that work?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is unconstitutional,
Yeah.
and it's owned by private banks. You see, the difference is if a government works properly as a referee, as a regulator, it allows the maximum freedom for people to produce new wealth and be creative, but within rules. And what you always have is people try to figure out how to game the system. And that's happened repeatedly and more aggressively since 1971, when we took away the one thing we had as something that grounded the system, which was the reserve, gold reserve backing the dollar. Now, that didn't mean that if you went to a bank, you could demand gold for every dollar you had. And the price of gold was relatively low then. It simply meant that if the government ran into problems, they had something backing up the paper, something real, namely gold reserve. And so that tends to cause trust, as opposed to if you're just issuing banknotes or issuing various kinds of IOUs like government bonds. Now, if the country establishes its credit and its trustworthiness, then people want to buy the bonds. And so you can get credit. And that's the difference. The difference between the pre-revolution and the post-revolution is before the revolution, you couldn't do anything without getting permission from the British. And that meant credit, trade, paying off debts on time, and so on. After the revolution, you had the ability to negotiate. And if it was unfair, you could tell them, we're not going to do this deal. And that's why bankruptcy protection was put in, to protect people from the intent to go outside the bounds to make money. Now, if you look at what we've done with the economy since 1971, how did we get $40 trillion in debt? How did we get the growing trade deficit? You know, the budget deficit is bad enough, but the trade deficit is worse because it means we're not producing enough to pay for the things we need. If we want lithium, if we want strategic metals, if we need uranium, virtually anything, how do we get it? Well, we sell bonds to raise cash from people who then have IOUs from the United States. That's what the bond markets are. Now, what protects us from someone who sells the bonds cheap so the value of our currency collapses? That's why you need to have a government as opposed to a freebooting pirate type system where everybody can do whatever they want. And so the people who are the monetarists are the radical free traders. Remember, Trump and MAGA oppose the idea of the World Economic Forum of global free trade. And yet, how do they make their money? How did Scott Bessent make his fortune? He made it through working with Soros.
Wow.
How did Lutnick make his fortune? Speculation on government bonds, shorting bonds. So you have people whose experience in economics is personal, private interest as opposed to the idea of a national interest. Now, it doesn't mean that you can do everything based on national interest, but if everyone's only concerned with their own private profit and has an ability to get around laws and, you know, like what did Jeffrey Epstein do? He showed people how to evade taxes. That was one of where he got his start. And how do they do that? You go to the offshore banks, the British banks. So if your argument is that we fought a revolution to get away from foreign money control, who the hell determines the value of your money right now? It's not the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve is a private company that is responsive to the private banking system that owns it, not to the government. And so with the idea that you see, that's what the Bank of England is. Did I just lose you, John?
I am here. I think I just lost my camera. So
okay.
let me switch to another camera and see if that'll work.
There.
There I am. Okay, now let me get...
Okay,
so we're back.
The idea of the Federal Reserve was essentially to protect the largest banks, the Rockefellers, the Carnegie Mellons, and so on, to establish a system that would benefit them, as opposed to what Lincoln did. After Lincoln was assassinated, his policy continued, the greenback policy, which was government issued money backed by physical goods production. And what was the big physical goods production in the second half of the 19th century? The railroad system. which enabled us to expand the country, to increase the area that was cultivated, the development of the steel industry, coal industry, and so on. That was where credit went. And it was so successful with the US Centennial Exposition in 1876 in Philadelphia. People from all over the world came and they marveled at how did the United States, this backwater, rural bunch of ignorant farmers, become so wealthy? And it was the Hamiltonian system. And there were people like Henry Carey, whose father, Matthew Carey, was very close to Ben Franklin. He was one of Lincoln's economic advisors. Peshine Smith. There were a number of these guys who worked on the physical economic policy of Hamilton. And people from all over the world went back to their countries and said, we want this. And where did it get implemented? Bismarck's Germany. When Bismarck unified Germany, at first it was a totally free market system, and their economy was crashing. And so Bismarck changed and brought in a national banking system modeled on the US and a tariff system, because they were being hammered by cheap British finished goods and cheap Russian grain. So all of a sudden, Germany went from being all these different principalities to being a unified country that was unified around an economic system. And the economic system was that of Friedrich List, who was, as a young German, was in the United States during the Hamiltonian period and the period of the National Bank. And he brought that to Germany with the customs union that allowed Germany to eventually establish an American system-style banking system. Who else did that? The French, the Italians, the Japanese, the Russians. And so by 1900, the whole world was moving toward the American system. And for the British, this was an incredible threat. And just one note on this, in 1896, William McKinley ran for president as a tariff president, not because he was just willy-nilly putting tariffs on things, but because he was a Lincoln Republican. He understood that you need to have a capability of the government to work with the private sector to increase the overall productivity of each person employed. And what was done to try and stop that? The free traders worked in the University of Chicago to set up a free market think tank, basically. And it was that against McKinley. But McKinley was winning because the veterans from the Civil War, as McKinley was, liked the Lincoln system. So what did they do? They assassinated McKinley and put in a pro-British guy, Teddy Roosevelt, to replace him. And we've been fighting ever since the battle between private interests über alles versus the idea of a general welfare. And John, there doesn't have to be a contradiction between the good of all and the good of individuals. That's the Hobbesian or Lockean system, which says that only a person who's willing to fight for himself first can make it. And if you have the whole population thinking that way, then you have no national consensus.
It is a fundamental difference between the American approach and the British and the ancient empires, in which they assume that the ones in power are in power because they are either smarter,
Or stronger.
or stronger, or have the right bloodline, or are appointed by God, and the rest of us are just serfs and peons. And from that point of view, it looks like a lot of thought is now being generated in the idea of, well, with AI, we're just not going to need all that many worker bees. Why don't we just let them die off, or maybe help them somehow with some medications to just get out of the way, because we don't need 8 billion people sitting around doing nothing. Uh, this is where this is headed. If we
Well,
don't revive this, the idea of humanity, and we are all one, and this whole idea that I think is behind a lot of the left thinking, of no aristocracy, no kings, no emperors, no empires. Let us all respect one another. Let's do the golden rule. And if we could just do that, I don't know. But it is a problem of entitlement, of an assumed entitlement that people either have got through their birth, or through being a very good servant, like George Soros, or what's his name, the Klaus Schwab.
well, there's another point here, which is that if you look at the way this system came about, it came about because of individuals who were able to, on the one hand, out hustle everyone else. And in many cases, that included things that were illegal, trusts, monopolies, things of that sort. But then they started writing it into the rules of the system. And you had a class, what you might call the Epstein class, people who do think they're better by birth and that they know what to do. Now, on the point you were just making about useless eaters, we just are finishing a pamphlet on what was Jeffrey Epstein really. And the first 3 parts or 4 parts are what I've written for the EIR. The last part is a very fascinating review of Epstein's involvement in eugenics research, life expectancy, and so on. Toward the end of his life, this is what he was doing. He was meeting with people like Peter Thiel, meeting with people like Larry Ellison, people who were thinking about, how do I save my seed so that the goodness that I do will last? Epstein actually talked about it that way. And this is a form of the Malthusian racism, where you start by saying that there are only certain numbers of people who really deserve to live longer lives.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest, as Hobbes said, life is short and brutal. So you have to squeeze whatever pleasure you can out of it, as opposed to the idea that by acting in the interests of the whole society, you actually get pleasure. And this is the difference between pursuit of happiness versus pursuit of property.
Because you can't be happy without other people. I think it's obvious.
Well, and also without the idea that your life has a purpose.
Yeah.
It is because you're going to die someday. What difference does it make whether you had millions of dollars during your life or just a little bit of money and a happy family? People with millions of dollars don't necessarily have happiness. And especially if they're afraid someone's going to sneak around behind them and steal their money. So that's why you need institutions. What the idea of a Republican institution is, that you have citizens who deliberate on what's good for the whole country. And maybe they have to temper their desires for a bit of time so that they can do something that will have a higher benefit. Now, some people dismiss that as altruism. Well, no, it's actually in your best interest to have a society that runs well and where your neighbor can benefit as well. Because if your neighbors are poor and you hit it rich, what protects you? You can, in the old days in Renaissance Italy, you'd build a big tower and hire a lot of soldiers to guard the tower. You go to cities like San Gimignano and some of these others where there are 13, 14, 15 towers, and the rich people would try to build a tower bigger than the next person's.
Building a stairway to heaven, Harley.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, of course, the Irish monks did the same.
Well,
You know,
unfortunately, religion is not always a clear path.
not
But
when
if
there's
you
Vikings attacking.
if you look at the Augustinian tradition, which is what the Peace of Westphalia comes from, the idea, the Augustinian tradition comes from what? It's the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
And Jesus is explicit. Jesus doesn't say whoever has the most toys when they die wins. There's a higher purpose to life than owning something, and that's the mistake that people make.
I want to go back to your very first comment, and that was that this is the fourth anniversary of the special military operation / Ukraine war, um, and tie it in with what we've been saying, in that when no, it's me now. Okay, what I want. Oh my goodness.
We got to get our correspondents to know that Tuesday at this time is our time.
Yeah, they must know. Well, I'm going to try to do it, to tie in the issue of what does America produce to the special military operation, and the fact that it's just gives on and on and on and on. And that, of course, is the military industrial complex. And that exists, in Europe as well as in the United States. And I get angry. I'll tell you, I will confess that I was somebody that up until 4 years ago thought Putin is never going to invade Ukraine. He won't do it. He won't do it. Well, woke up this 4 years ago and he did it. And ever since then, I've been following the war reports. I follow the mappers on YouTube, and I tell you, it is the most frustrating thing because hundreds of thousands of guys are dying and no progress is made towards peace. It seems to me that the American economy is financing and building, and that if there's anything we can build, it's military materiel. So is that a fair combination of ideas that we have turned into this? We're run by the military industrial complex for the military industrial complex, and the hell with everybody else.
Well, why did Putin feel he had to do something to address the uh, anti-Russian grouping that took over the Ukrainian government after the coup in 2014? Going back to 1990, February 1990, James Baker was meeting with Gorbachev, and they were talking about, would the Warsaw Pact dissolve peacefully? That is the Soviet equivalent of NATO. And the issue there was, what about Germany? What about East Germany? Could it be incorporated into a Germany that's not oriented against the Soviet Union? And so Baker said to Gorbachev, NATO will not move 1 inch eastward if you dissolve the Warsaw Pact peacefully. And Gorbachev made that agreement. The U.S. didn't stick to it. Now, Putin, when he came in a decade later, was watching as all the Eastern European nations were being brought into NATO. And the idea of American and British weapons being deployed on the Russian border, he said, we have no security, no safety from that. That's a threat to our sovereignty. Don't you understand it? And he had many encounters with Americans and Europeans where he said, we don't trust you to respect our sovereignty. And why could he say that? Because the decade of the 90s, Russia was being picked clean by bankers who were backed by NATO. And so during that period of time, Putin learned a lesson. Nevertheless, he still was very patient. He took the idea from Clinton and also even W. Bush said it, that Russia could become a part of NATO.
Mm-hmm.
That there's no internal division because Russia had a long history of a relationship with Germany and with France. So, but Putin was watching as neo-Nazis from Western Ukraine were kicking out the pro-Russian, actually ethnic Russians who lived in Ukraine. They were Ukrainians, but they spoke Russian. They had a background in Russia. And 14,000 of them were killed between 2014 and 2022. And Putin kept asking, can't you do something about it? There were two Minsk agreements where the West pledged that they would stop that. And they never did. They didn't stop the Ukrainian neo-Nazis, the Azov battalion, and so on. And so what happened? Putin finally said, we are going to have to take this into our own hands, because otherwise you're going to join NATO and the Eastern Ukrainians are all going to be toast. And he tried to talk to Biden about it. Biden was an imbecile. But Biden represents, you call it the military industrial complex. It was those people in the United States, in the corporations, military and others, raw materials and other things like that, who looked at Russia and saw a vast raw material wealth that they wanted to grab. And to do it, they had to break the power of the Russian state. And so they were betting that if they built up a Ukrainian army, they could weaken Russia. And so they used the Minsk agreement, which was basically a peace agreement, settlement, to train and arm a Ukrainian army, which was prepared in the first months of 2022 to move into Donbass, move into Donetsk, and take out the militia that was defending the ethnic Russians. And it was at that point that Putin said, okay, we have no choice but to move and do it quickly. And what he had hoped is that by a show of force, the West would say, okay, we get you. Because what were the Russians saying? What did Kennedy do when the Soviets put missiles in Cuba that could easily reach the US mainland? Kennedy was prepared to go to war over that. But he also was prepared to go to peace. And that he began a policy which became known as détente, of cooperation, of negotiation. And he was killed. You don't think the Russians know this history? They know precisely how the military industrial complex thinks, and that you can't trust them. And so the Russians are left with a very bad choice, which is fighting a limited war, which is what they're doing in Ukraine, where they're effectively wiping out the Ukrainian military capability, but NATO and the US keep building it up. Now, just this last week, there was a missile shot into 1,700 kilometers into Russia that hit a Russian plant that was involved in the nuclear capability. The talk now in Russia is that they're preparing possibly to use one of their powerful weapons to hit the plant in Britain that produced that tracking system that was used. If Putin does that, we're in a whole new phase.
Oh my God, yeah.
And they use the Oreshnik missile to do that. Now, this is where you see this private interest, which is how can we grab all the raw materials in the world? Look what the US just did with Venezuelan oil. Look at the threats against Iran. What are all these things about? They're about who controls the raw material wealth. The idea that if China comes into South America and builds railroads and ports, that's a threat to the United States? How? If the countries of South America become more prosperous, we're in an ideal situation where we could trade with them and make more money. The Chinese would actually do us a favor by putting in these rail systems.
Well,
this
you
is
know,
where
you can't convince people though, because the one thing that's, when you said Chinese, the first thing that popped into my mind was the report this week that Canada is now going to import actual PRC soldiers into Canada, I guess to guard their oil investments or something. But you know, I can get a little paranoid about the fact that hey, our country is going broke. We've seen it happen to Russia. You know, sell it by the pound. Are they not preparing to sell the U.S. by the pound too?
Well, when you say they,
Yeah,
who's doing the selling?
who's doing the
You,
selling?
you think the
Well,
Chinese are going to come over here and take over America?
yeah,
Well, I don't think they want to. They don't even
okay.
want to take over. Look, they could take over Taiwan if they wanted to. Why are they not doing it? Because they don't want to risk global war, whereas some of the people around Trump are willing to risk it. And so you have people who are out of control. That's the whole nature of the military industrial complex. And the problem they have is they have trillions of dollars of worthless paper in their banking system, in the hedge funds, in the private equity funds. And if push comes to shove and someone starts demanding something real in return for trading in these worthless instruments, we're completely broke. We're bankrupt. And so the idea of putting the Fed through bankruptcy reorganization is we really should find out what real wealth we have available to back up the $2 quadrillion worth of derivatives in the banking system, the large amounts of in hedge funds and private equity funds. And what you'll find is we are bankrupt. The longer you put it off by trying to get other people to pay money for it, the worse you get. And so that's why the tariff ruling by the Supreme Court, which caught people by surprise, it was a sign of actual patriotism by the justices in the Supreme Court, who basically said, this system is out of control and we're going off the rails.
And that's my fear, is that they want us off the rails. They want us to get to the point where we just throw our hands up.
But John, who's they?
The
It's
big banks, the people
yeah,
that
that's
own the
right.
big banks, right?
Yes, not the Chinese. The Chinese
No,
haven't
no.
done a damn thing to wreck the U.S. economy. It's our own bankers and financial institutions. But the Chinese just did another roundup of bankers who were swindling the Chinese people, and they put them in prison. They protect their people from swindlers. We honor them. Look what Epstein was allowed to do for so many years.
And Epstein, tax avoidance as opposed to, tax cheating, that's where the fine line is that lawyers and accountants get paid big bucks to discern. But the fact that he got the wealth by using offshore British banking, without regulation, the places where the drug dealers go to park their money, and he got away with it. That's what's got to come to a screeching halt, right? Don't we have to just wait a minute? If you want to be in our economy, you got to be an honest. You got to use real banking system. You can't just hide all your money, because that's where all the money goes. That's why Go
we
ahead.
just have a couple of minutes here. And one thing that's interesting about the arrest of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor is that he thought he could get away with it. Now, not only is he in trouble, but the whole network around him, Mandelson, McSweeney, and King Charles III is potentially in trouble. One of the things that Andrew did, he was considered the cheerleader in chief of arms trafficking. Mm-hmm. And he worked with a whole bunch of these illegal guys, like the Al Yamama case and the Iran-Contra. Andrew was essentially part of the gun running operation. You know who was a bigger gun runner than that? Was Prince Charles. He was known as Charles of Arabia. And after the Arab Spring, when British intelligence ran these operations to try and overturn the so-called oppressive Arab regimes, Charles went in and sold $14 billion worth of British armaments to the regimes that had trouble from the uprisings. These are people who are immoral, who pay for an operation. It's like the mafia. You pay someone to go and say, do you need protection? Are you worried about your window getting broken? And if you don't pay them, bam, they break your window. That's what this is. And it looks like the tolerance for this is no longer there when people are losing everything and finding out they're being swindled by these maniacs. And the only question is, can we get a mobilization to do the same in the United States to clean it out?
Exactly. Exactly. That's what my wife was saying right before the show. She's saying, well, yes, Mandelson, yes, Britain is doing something, but the U.S. is not doing anything. We're not doing anything, and I will just say, I want to see some perp walks. I want to see some
Here's
serious.
something people can do.
Yeah.
Right. Get the Epstein series that I produced. The EIR is going to put out a pamphlet. I have 3 or 4 articles on it, which goes through how this was it started as organized crime, and everything we're talking about is swindles. And if people read it and think about it, maybe they'll get mad enough that they'll do something in the midterm elections. That's what Trump's worried about right now. That's why he hasn't hit Iran already, because he's afraid that it will bring down the Republican Party. And that's what polls are showing. So the people are not as crazy as they seem. They're just not accustomed to acting. So we can give you a roadmap. People can write to me, John, if you put my email address and the LaRouche organization up on your program.
Yeah.
People can write, and I'll be happy to send you the pamphlet. We're going to have a pamphlet by next week on what the Epstein story tells us about the corruption.
Very good. Harley, you guys are working 24/7 to uncover all this stuff and lay it before the American people so we can make a positive choice for the future. And I am very grateful for you and all of your organization's work. So there comes the phone again. So let's say goodbye for now. And I will see you again in 2 weeks, I hope, Harley.
Okay. Very good.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Hello. Hello.